All right. All right.
Cool.
Thanks.
No problem.
Um, yeah. So to start, how do I pronounce your name? Is it Abby?
It's Abie, like the first two letters of the alphabet.
Okay, AB.
Mhm.
Great. And as I just said, the context here is I'm talking with as many people as I can get my hands on who were trying to help with COVID in one way or another, and sort of seeing what succeeded, what failed, what got in the way of bigger successes, and to sort of like get a map of sort of what were the big blockers for the world on doing better on COVID.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know anything about you except that you're the communications director for One Day Sooner, and David Manheim said that I should talk with you.
Yep, that's right. I am the communications director. I've been working with Monday Sooner since around May of 2020.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I maybe just give me some context first. How many people are is in the organization? Is the organization
Sure.
even the right word?
Organization would be is totally fine. Nonprofit advocacy group. So One Day Sooner began in March of 2020. There was a paper by three people: Nir Eyal, who is a bioethicist at Rutgers; Mark Lipsitch, who is an epidemiologist at Harvard; and Peter Smith, who is an epidemiologist at the London School for Tropical Medicine, proposing challenge trials as a potential means of accelerating COVID-19 vaccine licensure. One Day Sooner got its start soon after that. If I'm recalling right, someone from Open Philanthropy reached out to Josh Morrison, who is the executive director of Waitlist Zero, an Open Phil backed nonprofit that advocates on behalf of living kidney donors, saying, hey, there might be a use case for a nonprofit advocating for challenge trials. So Josh did some initial outreach and co-founded One Day Sooner alongside Sophie Rose, who is our co-founder and our former director of research. And One Day Sooner began as a nonprofit, not advocating for challenge trials as such, but advocating for people who were interested in taking part in challenge trials. There was a website called covidchallenge.com where people could put their names down and contact information and reasons for wanting to take part in a challenge trial. And within just a couple of weeks, there were over 10,000 people from across the world who said that they would be interested in taking part in a challenge trial. Today, that number has grown to nearly 40,000. And so for the past year, One Day Sooner has worked to promote the voices of for a long time, people who prospectively wanted to take part in a challenge trial. And now, now that the first challenge trial has begun, both people who are interested in taking part in challenge trials as well as the actual volunteers.
Okay, so to start with, it wasn't even like we want to push governments to do challenge trials. It's more like let's make there be a place where if people are interested in this, they can sign up, and that there would be known that there is interest in this. Is that about right?
That's right. At the very beginning, the main calls for of One Day Sooner, and you can look. There's a really good op-ed in Stat News from Josh about this. The main call was to do the scientific preparations that are a prerequisite for conducting a challenge study while the ethical debate was taking place. So there are certain practical steps that need to be taken to run a challenge study, the most time-consuming of which is actually preparing the strain of the coronavirus that would eventually be exposed to volunteers in a challenge trial in accordance with what are called good manufacturing practices, basically ensuring that the virus that you would be exposing volunteers to is sufficiently purified and tested so that you know exactly what you're exposing people to. And so in the very early days, One Day Sooner's function was to conduct research on the potential use cases of challenge trials, advocate for scientific preparation, and make the conversation about challenge trials more small L liberal, by which we mean including the volunteers who would be exposed to the virus in the ethical conversation. It wasn't necessarily just promoting challenge trials as such, though we also did that by the time. research showed that challenge trials could have significant potential to save lives.
Okay. That was three things. That was like doing the research to prepare. That was yeah. Can you just say that again?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So it was doing research. So there was an early paper in Clinical Infectious Diseases by a lot of One Day Sooner's research team articulating the potential use cases of challenge trials. That was one of our early functions. A second one was, and this is more my wheelhouse, working on communications, was to involve prospective volunteers in the conversation that was going on in the public discourse in ethics journals about whether or not challenge trials would be ethical. So including volunteers into that conversation. And what that means in practice is basically having volunteers say, you know, I am willing to take part in a challenge trial, and sort of arguing for their right to take part in a challenge trial. And the third function is advocacy-wise, calling on institutions to begin the scientific preparations to actually do challenge trials. So not necessarily to just straight up do them in the very early days of the pandemic when we knew very little about the virus and it wasn't completely obvious if challenge trials were needed. We were primarily focused on swaying institutions to increase their preparations for challenge trials. Eventually, that also shifted to just advocating for challenge trials, and we have been doing that for some time. But just talking about those, first early months where One Day Sooner was growing.
Okay, you say they were sort of like waiting for information to find out whether or not challenge trials would be necessary in this case. What was the like deciding factors in this situation? Like, what could you have found out that would have been like, actually, this is not as relevant?
Right. So challenge trials have a unique role in vaccine development. So there are phase 1 trials, which are small scale trials to test primarily for safety, but also immunogenicity, which is the body's response to the vaccine. Phase 2 trials primarily test for immunogenicity in a larger group of volunteers, maybe around 100. And then phase 3 trials are these really large scale trials, 30 or 40,000 people, to test for the safety and efficacy of a vaccine in a wide range of volunteers. And so at the very beginning, it wasn't obvious where challenge trials fit into that picture. So one thing you could do is run a challenge trial after a phase 2 trial. So that means you've tested a vaccine, it's safe, it provokes an immune response that seems promising, but there's no guarantee that it will actually be effective in preventing against a disease. So what you do is you run a challenge trial, which is to say you give volunteers that experimental vaccine and then deliberately expose them to the virus to get efficacy results rather quickly. So one option for the use case of challenge trials was to combine efficacy data from a challenge trial with a larger scale safety trial. So a trial where you just give maybe 10,000 people a vaccine, a diverse group of people, and if it's safe among 10,000 people, then you can combine the safety data from the safety trial with the efficacy data from the challenge trial, and that could obviate the need for a phase 3 trial. So a lot of the early research about challenge trials was to determine whether or not that was actually feasible.
Okay.
As one example.
So the basic idea here is if you can do a challenge trial in some point in the process that maybe saves you the need for doing some phase later on, like you're sort of doing two things at once.
That's right. So that was one potential use case of challenge trials, and the jury is still out as to whether or not that is actually doable. So an example is there's a vaccine called Vaxchora, a vaccine against cholera, that was licensed without a phase 3 trial, just solely off of efficacy data from a challenge trial combined with safety data from a safety trial. But challenge trials can be useful without obviating the need for a phase 3 trial altogether. So, for example, what you could do is, if phase 3 trials, at the beginning of COVID, we didn't know how long they would take. We didn't know if they would take, 4 months or 8 months. It really depended on how much the virus was spreading in, the population, because the faster the virus spreads, the faster a phase 3 trial will take. And one use of a challenge trial could be, you can get imperfect efficacy results. Imperfect because you're only testing your vaccine amongst young people for ethical reasons. You could get imperfect efficacy results on a vaccine, and that can give you an early indication of which vaccines to manufacture and prepare for distribution, such that once the phase 3 results reads out their results, you can right away begin on distributing the vaccine. So if you're running several phase 3 trials at once, you don't know which vaccine is actually going to be effective. Challenge trials can give you an early indication of which vaccine might be effective, and you could sort of optimize manufacturing and investment from that point. So a lot of the early research at the beginning of the pandemic was trying to suss out exactly what the role of challenge trials were if we were to start them right away.
Okay. This is a side note, I think, but you mentioned
Mhm.
a cholera vaccine that was approved for only on the basis of a challenge trial.
Right. So it was efficacy data from a challenge trial combined with safety data from a larger scale trial. And that one is called Vaxchora. I don't have the link right in front of me, but I can. Oh, actually, I do. I'll throw it in the Zoom chat right now.
So my impression is that generally, in terms of COVID vaccines, there was like, at least until recently, doing human challenge trials was sort of a no-no. It was just assumed that was not going to happen, but apparently this is a thing that happens at least sometimes.
Right. So for some background on challenge trials, they're done quite a lot and have been rather standard in vaccine testing for the past, I think, 30 or so years. So there have been challenge trials to test vaccines for malaria, cholera, gonorrhea, influenza, typhoid, dengue fever. But the reason these challenge trials are relatively uncontroversial is because these are diseases that are either self-limiting, which is to say, very little risk of severe disease or death, or we have a cure to these diseases so that if someone becomes sick in the challenge trial, there's very little risk that they will actually become really sick. The reason they were so controversial for COVID is because COVID both has, non-trivial risk of death, and we don't have a cure. So the debate became, would it be ethical to expose volunteers to this virus, given that they could die, and given that we don't have really good information on the long-term effects of this disease.
Okay, so human challenge trials are a common thing in vaccine development, but only in a context where we're sort of like can untrollify the problem. And there's not some risk of someone dying in your trial because you expose them to a disease. Therefore, it's sort of more comfortable all around.
Yep, that's well said.
Okay, yeah. Untrollifying. Maybe I'm not sure. maybe I could have found a better phrase.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So going back to the three things that One Day Sooner was doing. Early research, communication sort of with the public, it sounds like, and then advocacy. So communication and advocacy sounds similar, except that one is to the public and one is to governments. Although I suppose there's sort of different things that are being said in both cases.
Right. I think it's fair to say that the ultimate goal of communications and advocacy is the same, which is to increase preparations for challenge trials and encourage the use of challenge trials, since pretty soon after the pandemic started, we were convinced that challenge trials had the potential to save tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives if scientific preparations were done very expeditiously. So the goal of broader communications work, by which I mean having volunteers speak to journalists and write opinion pieces about their interest in taking part in challenge trials. We worked with a video team at Vox to make the case for challenge trials and other things like that. In addition to more private advocacy efforts, which is speaking with researchers interested in running challenge trials, the goal was to do the same, which was to encourage preparation and encourage the use of these trials, but one was more in the public sphere, which is to say, via news media. The other was more private, which is to say, like trying to, coordinate amongst researchers who are interested in doing these trials. And that dominated most of what One Day Sooner did in the summer and fall of 2020.
Okay. And did that shift, like you're emphasizing encouraging preparation, which seems good, but also notably if everyone prepares and no one pulls the trigger to be like, yeah, this is a thing that we're going to do, then that doesn't help at all.
That's right. And the case for preparation is a lot easier to make because there are a lot of bioethicists who, were and are very opposed to challenge trials, who, were supportive of preparation because, if you prepare for a challenge trial and then researchers discover a rescue therapy that reduces the risk significantly in a challenge trial, then the case for challenge trials all of a sudden becomes a lot less controversial. So the preparation ask was an easier ask at first, but you're right that if everyone prepares, no one pulls the trigger, then you get none of the impact. So it was largely both. So more specifically in the UK. By the summer, we knew that preparations were happening, and that the key bottleneck would largely be, trying to prevent a lot of the bureaucracy and friction that would prevent a challenge trial from happening right away. Whereas in the US, merely getting the NIH to announce that they were preparing for challenge trials was a really significant advocacy campaign in itself. And ultimately, it became clear by the end of the summer that the US and the powers that be were really opposed to doing challenge trials. And so we ended up deprioritizing advocacy in the United States by the end of the summer, just because it was really obvious that Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH, and Anthony Fauci were just not interested in doing challenge trials. We shifted a lot of our focus to the UK, and the UK began their first challenge trial in early March of 2021, a lot later than we would have liked. And of course, I think you miss out on much of the impact of challenge trials by starting them so late. But we still do think that challenge trials do have a really significant capacity to save lives, which I can go into the different ways later if it's helpful.
Okay. So a couple of questions there. So first,
Sure.
You say at some point you switch from sort of like preparation to sort of preventing friction to actually running these, especially in the UK. It sounds like. I guess because that's sort of the place that seemed most promising, or maybe the only place that seemed promising. What goes into doing that step?
Doing that step being switching to the UK?
Not necessarily switching to the UK, but switching to, instead of encouraging preparation, trying to just smooth the road to make this as easy as possible.
Right. So I would say it was largely sort of seeing the Overton window shift. So in the US, it was at a certain point a non-starter to try and get the NIH or the FDA to actually give some public indication that they would sign off on a challenge trial. Whereas in the UK, the calls for preparation were largely successful. By August, Oxford's Jenner Institute publicly announced that they were preparing for a challenge trial. And we knew that a lot of the researchers and bioethicists we were speaking with in the UK were very, pro challenge trials in general. So it just became a lot more feasible and seemed like the more strategic thing to do to actually call for the challenge trials to happen. So that is to say that, at the very beginning of the pandemic, we were pretty sure that challenge trials would save lives. By the summer, we were definitely sure that challenge trials would save lives. In the UK, it felt actionable and strategic to actually push for challenge trials. In the US, we were still pushing for preparation. And by the end of the summer, we basically lost hope that the US was going to do challenge trials in the near future.
And you could tell the difference mainly because, you were in contact with the researchers, and the researchers in the UK were like, "Yeah, I'm up for this." And then in the US, it sounds like, were there public statements from government agencies being like, "Yeah, we're not interested in doing this"?
Yeah, this is where we get into really interesting questions of advocacy. It's really hard both to know what is happening behind closed doors in decision-making spaces and to know the effects of our actions. But just with regards to the specific point of gauging researchers and policymakers in the US versus the UK in terms of their attitudes towards challenge trials, it was largely public statements from leading figures. So to get specific and concrete, toward the end of August, we were in touch with Adrian Hill, who is a researcher at Oxford's Jenner Institute, who we knew he was preparing for a challenge trial. He gave us a quote for a press release we sent out that said Oxford was hoping to do a challenge study by the end of 2020. We were in touch with some of the top bioethicists at Oxford, including Julian Savulescu and Dominic Wilkinson, who are adjacent to the EA community and were very supportive of challenge trials. In addition, there's probably one of the leading challenge trial companies in the world. So a pharmaceutical company that actually does challenge trials called HVivo was giving public indications that they were preparing for a COVID challenge study. So all of these indications made it really clear that there was progress on the UK front. At the exact same time, you had Anthony Fauci in the US saying things like, the purpose of challenge trials is to test vaccines when there is very little disease transmission in a population. We have lots of disease transmission in the US because it's a pandemic. So we're just not going to do challenge trials. We'll prepare for it. I think he called it a plan D, that we're really only going to do it if for some reason we're just unable to get a read on the efficacy of vaccines in our phase 3 trials. Then we maybe as a last resort would need to do challenge trials. But I think, the different attitudes in the UK and the US are reflective toward challenge trials, are reflective of broader differences in attitudes toward the pandemic, where you see the UK doing things like first doses first, and the US being a lot more conservative on that front as well.
Yeah, I'm curious if you have any insight into what's the underlying cause of that difference? Why does the UK have a different attitude towards COVID than the US?
It's a really good question. I have a few sort of armchair thoughts, though I'm certainly not an expert, and I'm sure you could speak to someone else who is more privy to these differences. I have a couple of guesses. One is that I think effective altruism has had a huge effect on bioethicists in the UK. So, for example, Julian Savulescu is the head, if I'm not wrong, he is the head of the Journal of Medical Ethics in the UK, or he has some prominent role there. Dominic Wilkinson is the head of the Oxford Practical Ethics Center and a bioethicist. Also could maybe be getting that title slightly wrong, but I know he has some prominent role there. Julian Savulescu did his PhD under Peter Singer, if I'm not wrong. And so I think there's just, Oxford ethics, there's a reason the Future of Humanity Institute is based there. It's because, EAs have a huge effect at Oxford. Oxford is the most prominent university in the UK. So that's one guess, is just the sort of ideology, I guess, of people engaged in bioethics in the UK. And so that's one guess, but the next point that I'm going to make is not actually a really good root cause explanation of differences in attitude in the UK and the US, but I've found in just I've obsessively tracked all press about challenge trials in the last year because it's my job, and there seems a greater tendency of researchers in the UK to really do rigorous cost benefit analysis, where I think in the US you see a lot of cost analysis, but not a lot of benefit analysis or cost benefit analysis. So in the UK, with a lot of decisions they make, it's well, here are the potential problems of going first doses first. Here are the potential benefits. Benefits outweigh the costs. Let's do it. Whereas in the US, I think I've seen a lot of takes on challenge trials that are just these risks are unacceptable. And a lot of, in really granular detail, trying to spell out the risks of challenge trials, but little mind was paid to, in granular detail, trying to analyze the benefits of challenge trials, which could be huge. When you're talking about a pandemic, just one day sooner could mean tens of thousands of lives, hence the name of the organization. Yeah. And I don't know why that's the case, that there's this difference in attitude in the UK and the US. But the proof is in the pudding. The UK has given their first dose to over 50% of people now, I believe, and their deaths have just plummeted from COVID-19. I think not to do a full scale comparison of the UK and the US. The UK has done a bunch of stuff wrong, but for one reason or another, there's this difference in attitude, and I think that explains a lot. There's actually one last thing that I'll add, which is that both the US and the UK have significant experience doing challenge trials, but I think the role of challenge trials and the academic consciousness in the UK is a bit more cemented because post World War II, they had a facility called the Salisbury Common Cold Unit, and it was a challenge trial facility to try and study the flu. And they would do these ads all around the UK that were go on vacation in the Common Cold Unit. You'll stay here in a quarantine facility for 2 weeks. You'll get sick. But like, it won't be that bad. It's just the common cold. And like, hey, we'll pay you like 500 pounds or whatever. And there's this funny story of like, this guitarist and this oboist who used to like duet at the facility, and then they got married. And so I think there's like slightly more just, cognizance of like challenge trials as a force in the UK. And that may have led toward it being a bit more normalized going into the pandemic.
Okay, I want to zoom in on one. So you said a couple of things there, and I definitely want to keep in mind that you're like, well, I'm being sort of speculative here. I'm not sure why these differences are. But you said one thing in particular, which is that you were sort of pointing at the bioethicists at Oxford as being like, it seemed like they were more interested in a kind of analysis, or I don't know, a particular kind of ideology that is less common in other universities in the world. That seems to suggest that there's some like, in fact, who the bioethicists are, what the bioethicists think in a country matters for the policy of that country. Is that basically right?
That seems basically right. I will again caveat the speculative nature of all my comments at this point in the conversation, but I think so. So, why exactly did challenge trials take so long, and why have they not even started in the US? It's really hard to know, but I think my take is basically just that there are many decisions that have to be made for challenge trials to happen, and each decision point involves friction. And it involves researchers sort of turning to one another and being like, is this really worth our time? We're experts during a pandemic. We could be doing a whole bunch of really valuable things. Should we really be doing this one thing? And one of those things is like, oh, will it just be a total PR disaster for our university or institution if we do a challenge trial and then someone gets like super sick and then, goes on CNN and talks about it? That's something you have to worry about. It would be a total like stain on the reputation of an institution if there was like a really serious adverse event from a challenge trial. And so I do think that, and I know that like companies and universities have called on bioethicists and pharmaceutical companies have like paid advisors that are bioethicists, and they sort of go to them and they say like, hey, would this be worthwhile? Or is this not a good idea? Can we do this? Can we not do this? And so to that extent, bioethicists actually do have a role in shaping people's views on these trials. There's also the feeling of, so in order for human subjects research to be approved, it has to get approval from what's called an institutional review board, or an IRB. And if you think that you're not, and IRBs are usually composed of bioethicists in large part. And if you think you're never going to get approval for a study, you're not going to be willing to put in the upfront cost to actually do that study. So also to that extent, you're just not going to put like the tens of millions of dollars needed to actually run one of these studies. Even if you just think there's like a 30% chance the study won't get approved, you really have to take that into account. And so I do think bioethicists, have had a role in shaping, the public attitude. And so, I don't want to like reduce it to that only. I think a lot has to do with, were pharmaceutical companies and vaccine manufacturers convinced at early stages of the pandemic that they actually needed to do challenge trials, or did they think that, oh, this virus is raging so much that we can get a read on our vaccines via phase 3 trials in just a couple of months? By the time we set up a challenge trial, we'll already, have a read on our vaccine. I think that was part of it too. But I think that like my case would be that like the bioethicists have an effect on where researchers spend their time, what researchers think is ethical, and to that extent have affected challenge trials. Though I will say that bioethicists are split. One Day Sooner had an open letter in July of 2020 with over 100 experts, calling for challenge trials, the majority of whom were philosophers and bioethicists. So there's a lot of internal debate about challenge trials, and there still is. We're still basically in back and forth with bioethicists who hate that challenge trials are happening right now.
Okay. I want to follow up on that in a moment.
Sure.
Who hates this?
Hate's probably a strong word. It's been a year of a lot of debate.
Yeah. Okay, but it sounds like the thing that you're saying, which I guess makes sense given the three agendas that you mentioned earlier. It sounds like there's sort of like three groups of people that you need to get on board and working together to make this work. One, you need researchers who will actually run the trials. Two, you need participants who will volunteer to participate in the trials, and 3, you need governments to, I guess, mostly approve them, like be like, this is legal.
Right. So in the UK, you actually don't need government approval. What you need is the approval of the ethics committee that is based at the institution that you're doing the trial. Though the UK government is basically bankrolling the world's first challenge study, and the UK government actually oversaw the creation of a special research ethics committee that, if I'm not wrong, was composed of like 30 experts to review the first challenge study, just because they wanted to be so sure. In the US, you actually need approval from the FDA. So in the US, you do need to get the government on board.
I see. Okay. I mean, so earlier I was asking what's the difference between the UK attitude and the American attitude towards COVID. And it does seem pretty notable if it's possible in the UK to run challenge trials if you're a researcher and like your institution is like, yeah, let's go for it. And in the US, you need to convince the FDA that this is a good idea. I'm not sure that that's the core thing. Like, probably there are underlying causes underneath that, but that does seem like a pretty substantial difference.
So it is a substantial difference, though I will say, just as a matter of fact, that the UK government has been really behind challenge trials this whole time, and so you would think it's just like an extra step where there could be friction, but in reality, I think like positive signals from the UK government actually probably expedited the or was at least an encouraging force for challenge trials in the UK. Though I don't doubt that having the UK government so involved in the world's first challenge trial was probably some of the reason it took so long, just because whenever you get a government involved with something, there's going to be additional red tape. In the US, I know of researchers who were interested in doing challenge trials, but didn't want to start until there was some positive indication that the FDA would approve of it and use and take the data seriously. Absent that, researchers, I think, were quite discouraged from doing challenge trials.
Okay, so it sounds like if it's a two-sided market, if you need researchers who will run the trials and participants who will participate in the trials, there was not a shortage of people who were willing to participate.
Not at all. Right, by a long shot, there were plenty. It was the opposite of a bottleneck. I mean, I think there was an internal paper at the NIH over the summer where they started considering challenge trials, and that paper said that the reason we're considering challenge trials is because of like the intense advocacy of volunteers and bioethicists, and so participants certainly were not a bottleneck, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think participants were like, and this is One Day Sooner's goal, where we're trying to lead the call, so dozens of op-eds from volunteers being like, I will do this, like start challenge trials, I'm ready to sign up.
Okay, and then sort of on the researcher side, there were like a number of reasons why a researcher might be hesitant. So like one is just like a question of, is this helpful? Are there better things that I could be doing? Like this is like, I'm sort of the world expert on the world problem right now.
Mm-hmm.
I need to figure out what the most useful thing to do is, but also sort of like broader questions of if I do this, is this going to like look bad for my institution, or not necessarily look bad, but cause problems. Like if we make a mistake here, this reflects badly on the institution that I work for. That's like an important consideration, and also the consideration of maybe that's the main thing. It's sort of like, how does this reflect? Oh yeah, and I guess also like, will this be approved, or will this actually be used? If I do the work here and everyone else is like, nah, this is not good, then it's sort of like participating in the system that doesn't help at all.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really apt summary. And I would just also add that like, if you're a researcher and you think challenge trials are scientifically useful, and there are a lot of people that are behind them, and you have the money to do it, and you think it's the most useful thing you can do with your time, you might still not want to do a challenge trial if you think that it just literally won't get ethics approval, right, either by your institution or by a government. And so like, unless you give high credence to the chance that it will get approved, then you might just not move forward.
Okay, so it sounds like the main I might summarize the main problem in getting researchers to do this is that the researchers are sort of forecasting what other people in the field will think. And if they are like a lone wolf that's like, yeah, I think human challenge trials are a good idea, and everyone else thinks that's not the case, it's just in fact not worth it to go ahead because you're not going to get approved, and everyone will be sort of looking down on this project.
Right. I think so. I think that's largely right. Though I'm going to add a caveat because like that framing would have this really just be an almost like, almost game theoretic or like, well, what are other people going to do if I move forward? Are they going to be more likely maybe to approve it because they know when I think in reality, there was actually like one really interesting thing about the development of challenge trials was that there's a lot of internal disagreement amongst bioethicists, but there's also a fair amount of disagreement amongst scientists just about the like completely non-normative, just like scientific questions of how valuable challenge trials will be. So there was a working group put together by the World Health Organization at the beginning of the pandemic to assess the feasibility and use cases of challenge trials. And scientists were just split down the middle on a couple of questions. So, for example, I think probably the biggest limitation of challenge trials is that you can only use for ethical reasons. You could argue you should be allowed to use old people too, but most ethicists agree that you should only use people who are between the ages of 18 and 30 because the risk of death if you're between the ages of 18 and 30 is something like 1 in 10,000. That's 3 times lower than kidney donation. That's twice as low as childbirth. It's on par with many of the risks people take for public service, and ethicists think are perfectly legitimate. If you go to people in their 70s and 80s, there's a 5 to 10% risk of death. You just won't do that in a medical trial. So they asked scientists, do you think that efficacy data on vaccines from a trial that just includes people who are young and healthy would be generalizable to the broader population? If a vaccine is effective on a 25-year-old in a trial, could you then say, oh, it's most likely effective and we should give it to someone who's 70? And scientists were just split right down the middle. I think it was something like a 10-9 vote or 8-11 vote about whether or not the data would be generalizable. And you do get many scientists just having different views on this and saying like, oh, challenge trials could help you identify a correlative protection, against COVID, understanding the biomarkers of immunity. And then you could do other vaccine trials where you just look for that proxy biomarker, and that could allow you to license a vaccine, just after a phase 2 trial, even combined with a safety trial. Then you get other scientists who say like, no, like a correlative protection, just amongst young people is still not indicative. So of like how it might work in older people. So there is just disagreement about scientific questions too. And you can see that now, like if you Google challenge trials good, challenge trials bad right now, you can find, one essay by Stanley Plotkin, who, they call him the godfather of vaccines. He's on our board of directors. He co-created the rubella vaccine, responsible for saving probably like thousands of lives every day. That might be a slight exaggeration, but one of the like best humanitarian people ever, who's super in support of challenge trials, has been calling for them from the get-go. And then you have other experts, for instance, Angie Rasmussen at Columbia, another like extremely qualified virologist who just thinks challenge trials won't do much good. And so I guess, in a year's time, we'll see who's right because challenge trials are happening right now, and the results will probably be published by the end of May. We'll see how useful that data, will be. But, there's both ethical and scientific disagreement on challenge trials.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like this problem is actually sort of a combination of a coordination problem and just like an actual, what are the scientific facts, figure like there's actual disagreement. And then on top of the disagreement, there's a like Keynesian beauty contest sort of thing where you need to predict what everyone else is going to do in order to do something sensible.
Right.
Okay. All right. So given that context, what sorts of things were entailed in advocacy? Like when you're reaching out to organizations, what did you actually do?
Yeah. Good question for sure. It dominated a lot of our mind space for the last year. But before I go into it though, I'm going to make one quick point, which is like from a sort of EA perspective, there is this disagreement, there is this coordination problem. The reason we come out decidedly on the side of challenge trials is because, if there's just a 50% chance that, challenge trials are, effective or actually yield the data that we think it yields, if you still do the expected value calculation, that's still saving plenty of lives. So I think, given this uncertainty, we still want to err on the side of caution, which for us means moving forward with challenge trials. And you see this argument being made by lots of researchers as well. But so moving into the advocacy question, I'll again, caveat that it's very difficult to actually gauge the effect of one day seniors advocacy over the last year. It's a lot of conversations with researchers who are somewhat privy to what is going on behind closed doors, but we don't know for sure. There are a lot of public statements that either reference our work or repeat some of the talking points that we've put out there. But it's super not obvious to me, who is really the person that was pushing through challenge trials in the UK. The approach that we took was largely to try and just
hold on. Can I back up on that?
Sure.
So you think that there was a person or maybe a few people who were doing the legwork of making this happen behind closed doors in the UK government, presumably, or maybe
it's possible. Well, we know there's a principal investigator of the current UK study, and I think there are many decisions that had to be made, and it's possible that there's a handful of people who were pushing it through. It's also possible that that's not the case, that it was just a researcher saying hey, I think this is a good idea, someone giving them a grant, and just everyone being on the same page. But one thing I'll say is that the process here has been not at all transparent, and I know there's some leading ethicists who have written a lot about challenge trials who still just aren't exactly sure how the decision processes are being made. I think that's in large part because the UK government has backed challenge trials all along, and the inner mechanisms of the government aren't super transparent. But so the tack that One Day Sooner took in this position of uncertainty is a couple things. So we held a weekly call throughout the summer and fall with researchers who were interested in doing challenge trials, and to try and mitigate coordination issues. So, for example, one thing that we ultimately did not do, but we're exploring for quite a while, was there were a team of researchers in England who wanted to do a challenge study, but didn't have the strain that was being manufactured, as I was talking about before, in accordance with good manufacturing practices. And One Day Sooner was, working to connect a group of researchers with a biotech company that could manufacture the strain. And so that was one path we took, was trying to actually just connect people, behind the scenes. Other than that, our main goal was to try and just signal to decision makers in really public and in-your-face ways that volunteers are supportive of challenge trials, ethicists are supportive of challenge trials. It's a bit clearer than you actually think. The ethical question is decidedly on the side of challenge trials, you should move forward with them. And the form that took was I think concrete examples of it are our July open letter, which was signed by over 100 people, a lot of leading moral philosophers and bioethicists on there. Adrian Hill signed it, and he's the leader of Oxford's Jenner Institute, their main institute that makes vaccines. And that was a big signal to decision makers that this is actually maybe a credible and legitimate position I can take. It's no longer so niche and controversial to be in support of challenge trials. We did a similar open letter to Matt Hancock, who is the health secretary in the UK, I think around September, with signatures from, I think, 12 Nobel Prize winners saying that challenge trials were ethical. And there, the effect of this, our hope, at its best, it snowballed into more and more support. So after our open letter, the Washington Post editorial board released a statement saying that US groups like the NIH should start preparing for challenge trials. And after that, there was an announcement that the NIH actually was preparing for challenge trials. But ultimately they never pulled the trigger. Again, they called it like a plan D in case phase 3s didn't work out. But our strategy was largely to just like make the public case, like win the public conversation about challenge trials. And the last thing I'll add here is that again, One Day Sooner's mission statement is not to advocate for challenge trials, but to advocate for challenge trial volunteers. And so conceptually, all of our advocacy for challenge trials is the result of advocating for volunteers, and volunteers want to take part in challenge trials. That's sort of the logic of how we see our advocacy. We like hold on to the possibility and take the possibility very seriously that at a certain point in the pandemic, challenge trials are just not a good idea. Like the risks will be too high to justify actually doing the trials. And at that point, we will argue strongly against them. But we see ourselves as like a megaphone for volunteers. And some of the logic there is that primarily the objections to challenge trials are that the risks are too high for volunteers. And so, I think we've gained a fair amount of moral credibility by like being the volunteers ourselves and saying we want to take part in these trials. Yeah. And rather than just being like I think the case for challenge trials would have been a lot weirder throughout the pandemic if it was just like scientists in lab coats saying like we want to infect people. Like that's really off-putting. And our goal has been to sort of like humanize the volunteers in the public consciousness and like make clear that there are people willing to take part. So that's like the tact we took.
Yeah. So instead of being like human challenge trials are a good idea, definitely we should do this in the abstract. It's more like, look, these are some specific people that would like to do this thing. It seems like it would help a lot. They're like ready to go. Mm-hmm. Like, if there's some reason why they shouldn't be able to do this thing that they think is a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a saying from disability activism in the I think it began largely in the 80s of like nothing about us without us. And I think that's sort of the tack that we've took, which is like most of the arguments against challenge trials are ostensibly for the sake of volunteers, so that volunteers don't develop long COVID, so that volunteers aren't duped into taking part in a risky trial and then they develop there's some serious adverse event. And the way we've tried to counter that is just by saying, hi, I'm Abie. I'd love to take part in a challenge trial. I'm not being duped. I understand the risk. A lot of us are kidney donors. So Josh, the founder of the organization, donated his kidney. I also have donated my kidney. The risk is higher, doing that than actually taking part in a challenge trial. So we've tactic-wise relied a lot on analogies to other risks people take, in the name of public service, and have done a lot to like humanize and show the like really diverse community of people from like all around the world, from the US, Europe, Africa, Brazil, who want to take part in these trials.
Okay. That's pretty cool. All right. So you're sort of like making it clear that there are people that want to do this. And I guess it's still, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like it's still not clear how much this helped or whether or not this worked. Like it did go forward ultimately in the UK. It didn't go forward in the US. Did One Day Sooner's efforts make a difference one way or the other? Like, do you have any sense of yes or no there?
So the answer to that is definitely yes. That One Day Sooner's work, has made a difference. Though I could not say in great detail, like at exactly which points in the decision-making process we have had an effect and what that effect looks like. So I'll give one story of we try to be as self-critical and self-reflective as possible and think about ways that we may have made things worse. And I think one counterfactual world where it would be better if One Day Sooner never existed, which I know I'm convinced enough that this is like not the case. Otherwise, I would have quit my job a while ago. But one world where One Day Sooner has done like bad would be if like challenge trials are just this necessarily controversial issue. Any coverage about challenge trials is therefore necessarily going to be two-sided, and challenge trials really would have just happened right away if there wasn't this like strong public debate about them. And maybe it's that public debate that like scared researchers off, are like, oh my gosh, everyone is thinking about this, everyone's talking about this. If it goes wrong, there's going to be such public attention on me. That's one world in which like it would be better if this was kept behind closed doors. That goes against our values in a lot of ways, or like a lot of what we advocate for is transparency in the process. And in general, like as a rule, I think, myself and other people at One Day Sooner don't like the world in which, like pandemic decisions are, in a smoking room and there's little citizen engagement. But it's possible that a lot of the back and forth in the public about challenge trials has actually deterred researchers. The reason we don't think that's the case is because we've just been in touch with a lot of researchers who are moving forward with challenge trials, and at many points have checked in with them about our strategy and have like gotten the thumbs up along the way. So it's not like we're so unaware of what's going on behind a lot of the closed doors. But the people who are actually running the UK study, it's yet to be seen. Like we haven't been able to like get in touch with them and say like, hey, it was like the work we did like empowering for you, or was it like a pain in the neck? And we're pretty sure it was empowering, but like we just don't know yet because so many groups are like not interested in publicly commenting on challenge trials just because it is this fraud issue.
Okay. Now I imagine the researchers that are doing challenge trials right now are pretty busy, but it sounds like you haven't talked to them, or have you not talked with them at all, or like what's your relationship with that group?
Our relationship is pretty positive and pretty professional and again, we've checked in with them at many points. So like we're pretty aware that we're not having like a really that our press hasn't been largely pain in the neck. They've been because we are this outsider advocacy group, they haven't been keen to just like share all their details with us. So one other thing I'll add is that right now, a lot of our advocacy is about trying to get the UK challenge trial team to publish the protocol of their trial. And there's like a lot of strategy behind, or I could go into like why we think that's an effective strategy for like the medium to long run focus of the organization. But that's like annoyed the trial team quite a bit because it's been like this outsider group trying to say like be more transparent. We see little costs in doing it now because the challenge trial is underway, so it's not like we're gonna it's no longer adding friction to the progress of challenge trials. So we have a sort of interesting relationship with the team that's actually running the trial. But there are other researchers that have been planning trials for some time. So earlier this week, it was announced that Oxford got ethics approval for a reinfection study where they're going to be deliberately re-exposing or deliberately reinfecting volunteers who have already had COVID. We've been in touch with the PI of that study for some time. There's a group in the Netherlands at Leiden University that's preparing for challenge trials, and we have quite a positive relationship with that team as well. But again, like a lot of the one really concrete example of like we just don't know is the UK Research Ethics Committee, this group that had to approve the world's first challenge study. They're anonymous, and their meetings are very closed off to the public. And so there's one transcript I'd die to see. It's like what those conversations look like at different points in the pandemic, where they were like, deciding whether or not to like approve recruitment for the trial, then ultimately, deciding whether or not to approve the trial itself. What did that conversation look like? To get really specific, I actually co-authored an op-ed with Julian Savulescu, who's an ethicist at Oxford, the morning that the UK Research Ethics Committee met and approved the trial. And I honestly don't know if the effect of that op-ed was to like actually encourage them to approve the trial, or if they were like, oh my gosh, public engagement, like stop telling us what to do. We're the experts. We can do this on our own. So there are a few like, transcripts that I'd really kill to see that I think would be really interesting.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to double back on this special ethics board. Like that, like if I'm, because again, that seems like another thing that was a difference between the US and the UK is that like something special happened here. And I'm curious, I don't know if you would know, but like what were the upstream things that caused this to be created? Who decided we need something special here? Let's get some experts anonymously, and we're not going to publish the transcripts.
Mm-hmm. I actually don't know. I'm pretty sure that because the UK Vaccine Task Force, which is a group of experts that reports to Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, the UK Vaccine Task Force funded the world's first challenge trial. I think my guess is that they were the ones to call on this special research ethics committee to approve this trial because they knew it was, particularly ethically controversial. But a lot of the decision-making procedure, who ends up in that committee, how often that committee met, because there's a chance that if they just met monthly, maybe that was a grave error. Maybe that could have delayed the approval of the trial by several weeks. It's just we just don't know exactly how that committee was made, what influenced their decision making. We just have sort of speculative reasons, which isn't to say that they're not good reasons, but nonetheless speculative, to think that our advocacy work in trying to win the public conversation about challenge trials positively affected overall sentiment toward challenge trials, and hopefully made it more likely that the team would approve them.
Although it sounds like from the sort of work that you're doing, it's sort of it's not. I'm not sure exactly how to say this. It's not targeted. It's sort of we're going to broadly try to increase the I don't know, the vibes around a thing, or the we want the conversation to be going in a particular way, but it makes it harder to be yes, this particular intervention point or this particular place where counterfactually something would have gone one way, but instead it went the other way. You just don't really have access to those. You're a few steps. Those are a few steps downstream of all the things that you guys did.
I think that's accurate. I will say that at the very beginning it was just broadly making the case, and then we focused in on the UK toward the end of the summer, since that was clearly where things were promising, and then we focused in on Matt Hancock, who is the health secretary of the UK. We addressed our open letter to him. But we, we're a group of, largely Americans, and we have a bunch of UK volunteers, but we just don't have the political connections that would allow, or I don't think we're just not established enough in a lot of these spheres to get on the phone with the key decision maker and try and sway them. So a lot of our work has been, especially my work, working on communications, has just been okay, what are the most prominent UK newspapers? How can we get, how can we signal that challenge trials are as favorable as possible in those newspapers, under the assumption that a lot of the decision makers are reading them.
But it sounds like if you had the opportunity, if you had the connections, getting on the phone to talk to the decision makers would have been a good thing to do.
Right. I mean, I think that a lot of experts have the attitude that is something I'm the expert, and so they're not, they'll only listen to some people and not others.
Yeah.
One example here, one person I'd love to talk to, is responsible for funding us quite a bit, which is really great. Is Alex Tabarrok, who's pushed a lot of the. I'm actually not sure if it's Tabarrok or Tarabok. I think it's Tabarrok, right?
I've heard Tabarrok, but
okay, cool.
I read it, so
yeah. I'm sure it's
not sure how it's pronounced.
Yeah, and he's pushed a lot of the right ideas in the U.S. And I know he's done so via Marginal Revolution, his blog. I'm sure he has some political connections. But that sort of science activism, the best you can do, I think, is exploit the connections that you do have and make the public case for a given idea. And so when Alex Tabarrok got Ezra Klein to write about why first doses first is a really good idea in the New York Times, and 40% of Biden's staff follow Ezra Klein on Twitter, that's a pretty clear potential causal path of an idea, getting to a given place. And certain decision makers only take certain perspectives seriously. So basically what we've done is tried to broadly make the case under the assumption, like not knowing exactly where like the path of impact would go, but like knowing that like people are reading the stuff we're putting out, and hopefully we're like influencing some minds.
Okay.
Mhm.
And I guess I want to ask, so you said at the end of the summer you switched away from focusing on the US because that seemed less promising, switched to focusing on the UK because that seemed more promising, and also switched from encouraging researchers to do preparations for challenge trials to trying to decrease the friction for doing challenge trials. What was entailed in decreasing friction?
So what was entailed in decreasing friction, a couple examples are, one, for a while we were really interested in connecting like this biotech company that was potentially interested in manufacturing the virus for researchers. Yeah, so that's one example of like trying to decrease coordination problems. Another was, so in October, it was announced that the UK, this consortium, so the UK Vaccine Task Force, the Royal Free Hospital, which is like a leading hospital in London, hVIVO, which is this pharmaceutical company, and Imperial College London were establishing the world's first human challenge program to establish basically a COVID challenge model. That was announced in October. The goal was to start the study in January. And then there was just, as far as public announcements were concerned, just radio silence in December, January, and February. And we basically suspect that the reason for that is that the UK Research Ethics Committee reviewed the trial, maybe asked for more data about what the risks are, or asked for greater clarification about the role of challenge trials once Pfizer and Moderna were licensed, but sort of kept stalling. And it took until early March for the trial to begin. So we know there was friction then, but we, the UK Research Ethics Committee was like pretty immune from from the public eye. They were, the actual people on the committee were anonymous. And I think part of the, like by design, the committee was not supposed to be influenced, because it was like this ethics committee is not supposed to be influenced by outside stakeholders for the most part. So the best we could do to reduce friction during that time, or so we reasoned, the best thing we could do to reduce friction was just to continue signaling public support for challenge trials, such that if the UK Research Ethics Committee suspected that a lack of public support for challenge trials was a reason to not move forward with these trials, that concern would be allayed by our advocacy.
Okay.
And this wasn't entirely speculation, because a lot of thought leaders, bioethicists who have talked about challenge trials have brought up public trust, like jeopardizing public trust as a reason to potentially not move forward with challenge trials. So much so that the University of Southampton, a university in England, actually, did a whole focus group on challenge trials, a whole study to try and see what the average Brit thought of challenge trials. And this was a talking point that has been repeated throughout the last year. Like, oh, if you do a challenge trial, something goes wrong, you just jeopardize all trust in vaccines in general. Mm-hmm. And a lot of our advocacy toward the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021 was just continuing to get positive news out there about challenge trials that signaled that legitimate people, i.e. or relevant people, which is to say volunteers and experts, were still in support of challenge trials, so that hopefully people thought oh, we should just move forward with these trials, and jeopardizing public trust is not as much of a concern because the public is relatively in support.
Okay. Is there anything that you would have done differently with the benefit of hindsight?
Yeah, good question. I think it's so part of me thinks it's too soon to tell. So I think there are things that if in 6 months' time a lot of questions are answered about how this process worked, then I think I could confidently answer that there are certain things we would have done differently. So, for example, if this trial ends, or it will end, but if once this trial ends, it'll end in late May. We get there's less opacity around the ethics committee and a lot of the researchers on the trial. And someone says in an interview, like, hey, it was really annoying when there was all that press, in those latter days. It like annoyed the ethics committee didn't make them. Or like, you do proof challenge trials. Then of course I'll say one thing we would do differently is like be more quiet while the ethics committee was deliberating. I think like ex ante, there are good reasons why we moved forward with a lot of press. But I think it's like we take seriously the possibility that like quiet would have expedited the process that we give it. We think it's less likely than not. Other things we may have done differently. I think that we, on the flip side, there was a lot more, like we still did our best at the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, to keep pressure on in the UK, but we actually didn't do as much as we did in the summer and the fall. And so the metrics we use for this are like, we subscribe to a media database that shows press about challenge trials. And we check we have our website traffic, and we also just have a running log of like public statements from influential figures about challenge trials. And it just decreased substantially toward the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. And there's a case just that the opposite is true. Like, we should have done way more in those months to like, push the ethics committee. Maybe their like feet weren't held to the fire as much. And so I think there's a chance that we should have done either of those things. And the truth is, I'm just like not equipped to say at this point which one would have been a more strategic route. That's pretty much all I can say for now. I think like it's too soon to do that's all to say it's too soon to do the postmortem, I think, on challenge trials and like our advocacy, but we're really keen to do it when we can get the data that would allow us to do it. But it's such an intricate government process and a regulatory process. And we're still like quite busy right now with a lot of the work with the sort of forthcoming trials that we just haven't done it.
I mean, from my perspective, I mean, I imagine it's even more so for you guys, but from my perspective, it's sort of frustrating because it seems like, it's not for sure obvious, but it seems like we would have been better off with more challenge trials earlier for getting better vaccine data earlier. And the process that determines whether or not that happens is like quite opaque. Just like hard to say what specifically needs to happen or got in the way. And like you guys were doing a bunch of work, and that work basically amounts to like, we're going to pump like attention and we're as you say, sort of win the public conversation. We want like the energy around this conversation to be one way instead of another way, and then like fingers crossed that leads to decision makers doing one thing instead of another in places that we never get to see.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating, honestly. I mean, it's been still like an invigorating year, like all in all, but like in terms of like being confident about the impact of our labor, it's quite unclear. And I was speaking with a PR firm in the UK that does PR for Future of Humanity Institute and government advocacy for the Future of Humanity Institute that I can connect you with after the call if you're interested. And it was super interesting because I called them like maybe 2 months ago, and they were saying like, this has been such a good year for like our advocacy with AI. And it's been like such a good year for, he gave one other example, and he said like, we just haven't been able to get anything done like with pandemic preparedness, which is crazy because like you'd think this would be the year. And some of the reasons he speculated were like, for one, everyone is just so busy that they're just like not willing to like, listen to like outside advocates for one. And that like, whereas, other people are less busy and are willing to listen to us. But also just, a lot of the processes are really opaque, and like they're not made by elected officials. They're made like by staff scientists. And that's probably, for the better, but it's still like, it just makes it a hard realm for advocacy. One other example I'll give here is there was this huge question in the summer and the fall of 2020, which is like, what actually is our maximum vaccine manufacturing capacity? When we hear like all this news about like Moderna says they can make 1 billion doses in 2021. Should we be thrilled because that's like amazing and like actualizing our full manufacturing potential, or is that like actually not that much? And to the best of our research and our conversations with experts, we just like weren't able to get a good answer. And part of the reason was that, and this was said in an article that I can try and dig up and send after the call, that vaccine manufacturers intentionally obfuscate this point so that they can use it as a bargaining chip. Because if you say publicly your full manufacturing potential, you're just giving away this sort of chip you have in conversation. And so a lot of people were thinking like, oh, maybe we're working around the clock doing everything we can to maximize the amount of vaccines that we're making. Who would have expected that like Joe Biden just gets elected and then just brokers a deal between Johnson & Johnson and Merck starts manufacturing, Johnson & Johnson? Like, how would you have, even if you knew that Merck had that capacity, could you have advocated for that? It's just like from the outside, I think a lot of these decisions are just like, some people are in the know, some people, like influence decision makers. Sometimes people who are in the know and can still influence decision makers like Stanley Plotkin, not enough to actually move the needle. So it's definitely been a frustrating year, I think, for like outside advocates who actually want to make change.
Yeah, it sounds like, positioning to not be on the outside is just like very valuable for making things go well when, for instance, there's a global pandemic.
Right. I think that's absolutely right.
Okay, you said like maybe when the information, when more of the details come out in 6 months, you'll better be able to say like if there were mistakes or if you would have done something different. I'm curious, is there particular information that you would like? So you said already that like you want to see the transcripts on the day that they were talking about this. But like, yeah, what information could you find out that would inform like, given this, I would have done something different, or I think we should have done something different?
So I would like to know the people who are involved in the UK study that's ongoing right now, what they thought of all the public conversation around challenge trials. Did they think that a lot of there being a lot of positive attention in the UK was empowering, or did they interpret it as a magnifying glass on what they were doing in a way that increased their trepidation because there was just a whole lot of sunlight on what was going on, and that was like scary because they knew that like the public was over their shoulder. Did they think it was the latter? Did they think it was like, oh my gosh, I would have been so worried that of doing this without a sort of public sanction, and the existence of lots of positive attention on challenge trials actually like swayed decision makers and made my life easier. That's one piece of information that I'd just be interested to hear the take of like that. Yeah, especially people on the research ethics committee. I think that's the key decision, or the key or actually that's the key information I want. I also shouldn't frame it as a binary. It's totally possible that they're like, oh yeah, we actually don't pay much attention to like the public conversation at all. It's really just a substantive disagreement among scientists and ethicists that's based on like argumentation, like different ethical frameworks would permit different types of trials, different scientific views give different conclusions about how valuable challenge trials can be. I wouldn't frame it as like, either drastically positive or drastically negative.
Yeah, is it possible that in fact all the work that you guys did was sort of moot because it just didn't, like the public conversation didn't matter that much?
So it's certainly like possible. We wouldn't. I'll give the caveat at this point in the conversation that like I'm the communications director for One Day Sooner, so like a lot of the conversation we've had is like focused on the communications efforts that we've done. If you would have had a conversation with, for instance, with like Ginny Schmidt, who's our research director, she would have given like a different. She would have just naturally emphasized things that I am emphasizing less. Sure. I think it's so. More to your question, it's possible that like the work we've done hasn't had too much of a material effect on if challenge trials have happened sooner or later, and I think that, if that's the case, we'd still like be happy that we spent this year, doing this sort of work, because I think our like more medium to long run goals as an organization are to empower research subjects in the research decision making process, and that from an EA lens, I think would lead to more high impact trials, because one interesting thing about the institutional review boards and ethics committees that ultimately made decision on challenge trials is that none of them had any prospective volunteers on the committee. But that's a bit weird that they didn't, because the whole committee is deliberating over what is best for volunteers. To not include volunteers in that conversation, we think is fundamentally illiberal. It's not taking the sort of like freedom of, or the autonomy and freedom of speech of a volunteer seriously, and instead involves this like surrogate representative when we actually don't really need one. Like, for instance, I've volunteered for a challenge trial, and I feel like perfectly capable of like voicing why that's the case. I don't need someone to like do the analysis on my behalf. So I think our longer run goals are to set that into place, or put that into place, have research participants more emboldened in this process. And I think that the amount of like public attention that volunteers have gotten in the challenge trial conversation is good, even if it did not make challenge trials happen sooner for COVID-19, because it may set a sort of precedent in place that volunteers are involved in the conversation about challenge trials. And we've developed as an institution, One Day Sooner, a lot of good relationships with researchers. And when there are future trials, I think our goal is to include volunteers on those committees. And I think you'll find, when the results of the first few challenge trials are reported, I think there's going to be something like a huge postmortem across the world, like what happened with challenge trials, like why did it take so long? Were they worth it? And there are going to be, fancy panels at like the WHO and a lot of these institutions. And our goal from here is to like make sure that those aren't just researchers and ethicists, but like have volunteers who actually took part in challenge trials be on those committees and say like, hey, like I wish I could have been more involved in this process. And if that's more normalized going forward, then in future pandemic contexts, when there's this big conversation happening about challenge trials, I think like you'll get like high risk, high reward trials, because hopefully you'll have volunteers saying like, I'll take part, their perspective will be taken seriously.
Okay. So in some sense, even though, like, I mean, at least hopefully we're sort of getting to the end of the pandemic phase, challenge trials, like some of them are happening, but like I might think that like, all right, now One Day Sooner sort of like spinning down the things that they're doing, sort of like you succeeded as much as you succeeded. But in fact, it sounds like you're saying actually the next few months are, if not as important, but like in the same order of magnitude of importance, because there's opportunities to like reset the norms potentially about how this discussion goes and how participants get to participate in that discussion.
Yeah, that's definitely an apt summary. I think I've spoken with a lot of pandemic preparedness advocacy groups and their representatives who are really hopeful, that there will be a really robust policy response to this pandemic. It's really, if there was ever a time when like a huge bill to promote science, I mean, in a sense, this is like Biden's infrastructure bill, but it's tied up with all these other things. But like, if there was ever a time where like lots of investments and preparations would be made for future pandemics, it's probably post-COVID. We can all point to this thing that just happened and say we don't want that to happen again. And what we'd be advocating for is less of some provision in a bill that would allocate $5 million or $500 million to something. It's more changing the bioethical paradigm around human subjects research. And we think that this, the COVID, post-COVID, it feels weird to say post-COVID when cases just hit an all-time high worldwide. But we think
we're not there yet.
Right. But we think that, even right now, the like bioethical terrain is ripe for advocacy in terms of like empowering volunteers. and there, so a lot of things we're going to be doing over the next year involve like getting volunteers to like actually some of our more like grad student volunteers to like write ethical papers about like empowering research participants in this process. And one concrete example here is the Society for Clinical Trials, which is one of the big organizations that holds conferences every year on the ethics of human subjects research. Just in a few weeks is doing a big panel on challenge trials, and it's like a couple ethicists, one principal investigator of a study, and Alistair, who's our UK chapter manager and just like got home from the quarantine facility after partaking in the first challenge trial. And so that's a lot of our goal from here, is to like elevate people who took part in this trial and try and get their voices in the discussions that are going to be consequential.
Okay, cool. Mm-hmm. All right. Is there anything else that I should ask you, given all the things we've talked about?
Let's see. I think we covered a lot. I'll definitely let you know afterward if I think we undercovered anything that's important.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that's most of it.
Like one maybe more specific question is there anything else that you would say in order to give me a clear picture of what this was like for you guys and how it went that is sort of missing from my story so far?
So the one thing that I think I mentioned this before, but for clarity and emphasis, I will say again, is that a lot of the reason challenge trials didn't happen sooner was like genuine disagreement about ethical and scientific issues. There's one thing that I think everyone can agree should have happened sooner, that really ought to have happened sooner, which is that like scientific preparations for challenge trials should start right away in a pandemic, even as the ethical conversation is happening. So that's just super key. The investment to actually do the scientific preparation for challenge trials is very cheap compared to the potential societal benefit. And you can do those preparations and then decide that challenge trials are unethical and you never use any of them. It's to me, it's the exact same argument as warp speed, which is like, we are going to invest really significant sums of money in R&D and manufacture for all these different vaccines with no guarantee whatsoever that any of them are actually going to be effective. But we do so because it's like, if we just win one of them, then it will be, very, very rational. And the same thing should be true for challenge trials. It should be true right now for every single variant, like South African variant is like potentially vaccine resistant. There are other variants that are popping up all the time that are potentially vaccine resistant. Researchers right away should be preparing these variants for potential challenge trials. And in the same way that like warp speed was rational. So that's in terms of like one clear takeaway that feels like the most uncontroversial and easy step to make next time better is like scientific preparations are the thing everyone can get behind. They should start right away and can happen at the same time, simultaneously with ethical discussions.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, definitely. It was a really good conversation.
I'm glad to just like learn more about the nitty-gritty details about what's going on here.
Yeah. It was definitely a pleasure to talk. Just let me know like the future of this recording or like how you plan to use it. I don't think I said anything that I wouldn't feel comfortable being at there, but still would appreciate. The default privacy setting is going on my hard drive, so I'll share a copy with you, and so me, you, and the Chinese hackers who look through all my cloud recordings, maybe. And if it seems good to publish it as a YouTube video or a podcast or something, I will definitely make sure that you have the opportunity to check that and veto that beforehand. Perfect. Yeah, sounds great. Definitely feel free to reach out after this if there are any other questions you have, or if there's like any institution or person that I like name dropped that you'd want to be connected with. Just super happy to support your project in whatever way I can.
Awesome. Are there particular people that you think that I should talk with?
Um, so if you're interested in getting a really good breakdown of like, just like substance wise, the risks of challenge trials, David Manheim is like the perfect person to speak with.
Okay.
Though I think he may have less to say about like how decisions were made with the trials and has more to say just on the science,
Yeah.
and has really interesting things in general to say about risk communication. If you want, like, I'm sure Josh Morrison, our executive director, would be willing to speak. And he probably, he has a lot of, he's the one who's involved in a lot of these conversations that I've been referencing. And so he just probably has like a richer, he'll add a lot of nuance to a lot of things I said. So if basically you leave our conversation and you're like actually wanted to like learn more about like what One Day was doing and like what actually happened, like probably have a conversation with him.
Okay.
There are a lot of other people that I would say like, oh, I'd love for you to speak with them, but I'm just not sure if they would like take, to take an interview. But like,
Sure.
if you could speak with like Christopher Chu, who's the principal investigator of the challenge study. I mean, he's not doing any press these days.
Yeah, I don't think it's this month.
Right.
Maybe in the future.
Right. Okay. So I should have asked. So what is? So your overall goal is to just understand like what happened with COVID, like how things could have gone better.
I mean, so my overall goal is to figure out what is the problem with the world. I wrote up a blog post a couple of months ago where I was like, it seems like there are these pressing problems. Here is my here are some competing models for like what the core problem is, insofar as the core problem even makes sense as a category. And can I like get detail on which of these sort of like general intervention seem like promising for getting a civilization that can deal with important problems like COVID. Obviously not just COVID, like IBDA. I think a lot about AI risk. I think about civilizational collapse. And so I was thinking about these things and like theorizing and researching. And in thinking about that, I was like, how can I figure out like how do I distinguish between these hypotheses about what the core problem in the world is? And it's sort of convenient that I'm like right at the tail end of this global emergency, and I can like get in more detail and see like people tried a bunch of things, which things got stuck and why, and sort of backtrack that out to how could we set things up? What interventions could we do that would make the world way better off in general? So sort of in the macro, I'm like in the macro, there's the question of just like how do we make a better, saner, more effective civilization? In the micro, there's sort of like COVID in particular. How could we have done better on COVID? What would we have need to have done 10 years ago in order to do better on COVID? And I'm just looking to talk with as many people as I can in that trajectory.
Got it. So the one person there, and that's very helpful. The one person who I would, so if you're interested more in like why, or like outside advocacy in the UK on pandemic related issues, there's this one person I want to connect you with. I'm like embarrassed to have both forgotten their name for the PR firm that they work at. But it's the PR firm that does that it's FHI's PR firm. And
Okay.
wait. Alpenglow. Have you heard of them?
I have not.
Okay. His name is Angus Mercer.
Badass name.
Yeah, right. Alpenglow PR. And this was the conversation where I think this is right. Is this right? Hold on. Anyway, it's a conversation I had with someone saying like, wow, we've had such a great year, except for COVID stuff, or we've had or pandemic preparedness stuff, where we just haven't been able to get through to people in the government. And if it's of interest to discuss that more with, not with an eye to challenge trials, but with an eye to like just broader pandemic preparedness, then this is someone who's worth talking to.
Yeah, I guess for context, challenge trials, like one thing here is I just like made a list of like what are all the things that we could have done better. Challenge trials was one of the things at the top of the list, but that's
Mhm.
not the only thing that I'm interested in
Right.
in regards to the pandemic.
Yeah. So I'll just like email follow up, send a connection email once I find this guy's email.
That would be great.
Cool.
All right. Yeah, thanks so much for talking.
Yeah, definitely.
Good luck with your endeavors. I hope it all goes well.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, definitely feel free to chat if there's any way it can be helpful.
Will do.
Cool. See ya.
Bye-bye.